For most people, walking is such a natural part of everyday life that they don't ever stop to think about how it works. This video will give you a more in-depth understanding of gait. What is gait? Gait is typically defined as a method of locomotion involving the use of the two legs alternatively to provide both support and propulsion, with at least one foot being in contact with the ground at all times. There are two main phases of gait: stance and swing. For someone with a normal gait pattern, they would spend 40% of their time in swing and 60% of their time in stance during ambulation. Stance is then broken down even further into double limb support and single limb support. Double limb support occurs whenever both feet are in contact with the ground, which is about 30% of each gait cycle. The single limb support occurs whenever only one foot is in contact with the ground, which occurs about 30% of each cycle as well. A cycle focuses on a single leg and is demarcated by a repetition of a gait event, such as from right leg initial contact to the next right leg initial contact. In addition to the temporal aspects, spatial aspects are also important when describing gait. Spatial aspects describe the relative positions of the feet and limbs in space while walking. A step is described as the movement of one foot in front of the other. Step length is the distance that one part of the foot travels in front of the same part of the other foot during each step, like measuring from heel of one foot to heel of the other. A stride is a step of one foot followed by a step of the other foot. Stride length is the distance that one part of the foot travels between the same event in one gait cycle. Step width is the medial-lateral separation of the feet measured from the posterior midline of the heels of both feet. The terms stride time and cadence combine these spatial terms with measures of time. Stride time is the duration of one gait cycle. Cadence is the number of strides per minute. To determine walking speed, you can multiply cadence by the stride length. This diagram shows the 7 events and 7 periods associated with a normal gait cycle. The 7 events are initial contact, opposite toe off, heel rise, opposite initial contact, toe off, feet adjacent, and tibia vertical. The periods between these events are loading response, mid-stance, terminal stance, pre-swing, initial swing, mid-swing, and terminal swing. Now we will show you an example of these events and periods in normal gait. Gait analysis can be done in many ways. Looking at joint angles is one way to tell when and where a deviation is occurring. Looking at the video of a 24-year-old male with a normal gait pattern, you should see the following joint angles on the right leg. At initial contact, 0 to 3 degrees of ankle plantar flexion, 3 degrees of flexion at the knee, and about 30 degrees of flexion at the hip. At opposite toe off, the ankle should have 5 degrees of plantar flexion, and the amount of knee flexion should increase to about 15 degrees, and hip flexion should decrease to about 2 degrees. During heel rise, the ankle should remain at about 5 degrees of plantar flexion, the knee joint should be at its neutral position of 0 degrees of flexion, and the hip joint should extend to about 10 degrees. At opposite initial contact, the ankle should be neutral, neither dorsiflexed or plantarflexed. The knee joint should once again be flexed to about 10 degrees, and the hip joint should extend an additional 10 degrees for a total of 20 degrees of extension. At toe off, the ankle should have 20 degrees of plantar flexion, the knee should increase to 25 degrees of flexion, and the hip should decrease to about 15 degrees of extension. At feet adjacent, the amount of ankle plantar flexion should decrease to 5 degrees, the knee will increase to about 45 degrees of flexion, and the hip will increase to 20 degrees of flexion. Finally, at tibia vertical, the foot will transition from plantar flexion to neutral, the knee will decrease its angle of flexion to 25 degrees, and the hip will increase to 30 degrees of flexion. Now, looking at this video of a 21-year-old male, we see that his gait does not look like the video you just watched. Heel rise occurs early, right after opposite toe off, which makes it look like he's walking on his toes. His forefoot is excessively dorsiflexed during both toe-off and swing phase. His ankles also tend to stay plantarflexed during swing, leaving very little space between his toes and the ground. With all of these deviations noted, it would seem that he does not have an efficient walking pattern. However, it actually meets the 5 attributes of gait. These are the 5 attributes of gait. Stability in stance is the ability to maintain a stable position while in single leg support. Foot clearance and swing is the natural ability to flex the hip and knee and dorsiflex the foot and toe to prevent the toe from catching on the ground during swing. Prepositioning the foot for initial contact. The dorsiflexion of the ankle and supination of the foot-ankle complex to prepare the leg for the ground reaction forces at initial contact. Adequate step length is a step length that is energy efficient for the amount of distance covered in a certain amount of time. Finally, conservation of energy. An efficient method of walking that uses the least amount of energy. If there is an issue with any of the first 4 attributes of gait, it affects the person's ability to conserve energy while walking. In addition to the attributes of gait, there are also 6 determinants of gait, which describe mechanisms to minimize the undesired changes in the center of gravity. They are pelvic rotation, pelvic tilt, knee flexion and stance, ankle and foot mechanism, knee motion, and lateral displacement of the body. When walking, the pelvis is rotating to help reduce the angles of hip flexion and extension. It is also responsible for helping to increase step length while maintaining a lower center of gravity. The pelvic tilt drops the side of the swinging leg about 5 degrees to decrease the change in the height of center of gravity occurring at the hip. There is a 20-degree decrease in knee flexion during stance, which shortens the length of the leg in mid-stance. Both the foot and ankle are used to increase and decrease the leg length during swing. By plantarflexing the ankle and extending the knee, the leg becomes its longest length. The knee also changes the effective length of the leg and helps control the vertical displacement of the center of mass. By flexing the knee, the leg becomes shorter, and by extending the knee, it lengthens. With an immobilized knee, gait deviations such as hip hiking or hip circumduction would raise the center of mass or increase the amount of energy used. These deviations relate back to poor foot clearance and swing, and therefore suboptimal conservation of energy. Laterally displacing the body controls the width of the walking base. Widening the walking base increases the base of support, which in return increases stability. Now, let's apply what we've learned to an example of a pathological gait deviation. While watching, make sure to keep the 5 attributes of gait in mind. This is a classic example of peroneal nerve palsy or foot drop and the compensation behavior of steppage gait. For the next 30 seconds, watch this patient walk and note any gait deviations that you see. First, let's talk about the abnormalities that we notice when observing the patient. The left leg contacts the ground flat-footed, suggesting there are weak dorsiflexors. The knee does not flex during stance, but instead stays locked in extension. He stays extended at the knee to prevent himself from falling, which may be caused by weak knee extensor muscles. Finally, during swing, the patient has a hip hike to help clear the floor. This is a failure of prepositioning for initial contact. Notice the foot is plantarflexed and the foot strikes the ground flat. Now, notice during left leg swing phase, in order to clear the toes with an ankle that is unable to dorsiflex, there is an increase in knee and hip flexion over what would be expected during normal gait. And once again, we see initial contact with a flat foot and a fully extended knee. For most people, walking is such a natural part of everyday life that they never stop to think about how it works. With your new, more in-depth understanding of gait and how to analyze it, you should be prepared to begin assessing gait patterns.